And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, tonight's weather again showing low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska here. Starting to pull back to the west a little bit. That's going to keep surges of moisture going into the southeast coast, North Gulf Coast, and to a lesser extent, Prince William Sound, the Kenai Peninsula. Winds diminish over the Arctic coast and North Slope tonight, but snow showers and gusty winds for the Alaska Peninsula. That's where the strongest winds will be tonight. Lightening up winds here as you head north, kind of becoming calm there for the northern Bering Sea. Weak warm front spreads some warmer air, rain into the Pribilof Islands, light rain, fog, drizzle. And then for tomorrow, big front out here makes an appearance onto the western part of the chart there. Warm front spreading eastward, weak warm front here, and drying out over the western interior. Clearing possible, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula area, up into the Matanuska Valley, maybe the Tanana Valley as well. Light snow, eastern Arctic coast, and low pressure out here still in the western Gulf of Alaska now. Continues to pump moisture into the southeast coast, North Gulf Coast, but not quite as far west as it has been. And then for the day on Sunday, fair weather, light winds, colder temperatures over the central eastern part of the state. Pretty good conditions right down to the North Gulf Coast. Variably cloudy for Kodiak Island, but dry with light winds. Dry day for the Panhandle with light winds. Winter storm watch is out for the western interior here, especially ahead of the warm front. As warmer air comes in behind that, look for rain into the southwest coast, but pretty strong winds to 50 miles an hour, blowing snow all through the western interior here northward into the western Brooks Range. Coastal water forecast, southwest winds 20 knots here for the central and south coast. The north coast, east to south, 10 to 20 knots. Southeast winds 15 knots for all of the inside channel and water areas with seas up to 8 feet for Clarence Strait. Those swing around to the northwest at 15 knots for Sunday for Clarence Strait, northeast 15 for Passage Canal, or for Stevens Passage, and northwest at 15 for Lynn Canal. East winds 15 knots for the south coast, central coast, southeast at 15. Light east winds at 10 knots, seas 7 to 9 feet up on the north coast. Prince William Sound, north winds 20 knots for the day Saturday. And for the North Gulf Coast, north to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Northwest 40-knot gales for the Barren Islands tomorrow. Even stronger for Kamishak Bay out of the northwest at 45 knots. Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 15. And variable to north 10-knot winds here. So light winds, light and variable for Cook Inlet on Sunday. Northwest 25 to 30 knots, Kamishak Bay to the Barren Islands. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Light winds in the forecast for Prince William Sound, north at 10, seas down to 2 feet. Alaska Peninsula tomorrow, gale warnings, west-northwest winds, 40 knots, seas up to 18 feet. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, northwest winds 35 knots, seas 13 feet. And for Kodiak Island, gale warnings, northwest winds 35 knots. And then lighter winds in the forecast for Kodiak on Sunday, in fact all areas. For Kodiak specifically, west winds 20 knots and west-southwest on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula at 20 to 30 knots. Bering Sea side, south to southwest 25 to 30 knots there. And Bristol Bay looking at a south wind at 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians, west winds 30 to 40 knots for Saturday. Adak and Atka, southwest at 30 knots. And then 40-knot southerly winds from Amchitka Island to Kiska, Kiska to Shimia. There's a storm warning out for south winds at 50 knots, seas above 25 feet. And then for the day Sunday, gale warnings here for the western Aleutians. West to southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Adak and Atka, southwest winds 45 knots. Gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians. Southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. And for the southwest coast, Saturday, northwesterlies 20 to 30 knots, strongest south of Nunivak Island. Northwest at 15 for St. Lawrence Island. West 20 for St. Matthew Island. Westerly gales for the Pribilof Islands at 35 knots from the west. And southwest winds 35 knots for St. Paul and St. George. A little bit stronger St. Matthew Island. Southwest 40 knots, 25-foot seas there, about 18 feet for the Pribilofs. 30-knot southerlies, Kuskokwim Delta Coast, Yukon Delta Coast south at 25. South winds 30 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Southeast 40 knots for Norton Sound with seas up to 8 feet. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, much lighter winds in the forecast, east at 20 knots, seas 4 feet in the ice-free waters. Small craft advisories here for the western and central Arctic coast, east winds 25 knots, variable winds 10 to 15 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then for Sunday, gales coming into the Chukchi Sea from the southeast, 40 to 45 knots. Small craft advisories for the central and western Arctic coast, southeast winds 30 knots, and then east-southeast winds 20 to 25 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.